If you're looking for a fun project to build that you can actually use, we will be doing just that in this video. We will build this app from scratch, writing our own CSS and React components. We will add some cool features like adding a character count when the user types. We will add a search bar that lets the user search for a note. We will add dark mode, which you can toggle on and off, and even save to local storage so that you can use this app in real life. You can find the links to the style sheet and the finished code in the description. I've also included timestamps in the description so you can skip or jump to different parts as you wish. Let's get started. We'll start by creating a new React project. The simplest way to do this is to use Create React App. This is a tool that lets us create a skeleton app without having to set up all the config and infrastructure files ourselves. You can explore this more by going to the GitHub. Check the links in the description for this. Okay, so we'll open up Visual Studio Code and we'll open a new terminal by going to Terminal, New Terminal. This should open for us at the bottom. In here, we want to change our directory to where we want our project to be. So in this case, I'm going to put the project on the desktop. Next, we'll type npx create React app and we'll give it a name. In this case, we'll call it React Notes app. Next, we will install React Icons, which is a package that gives us some nice icons to play with. Go ahead and change your directory to the new project by typing cd React Notes app and type npm install React Icons. Next, we'll open the project in the editor. So if you click the Open Folder button, select the folder that was created for us by Create React App and click Open. This will open our project in the editor. As you can see, the files have appeared in the project tree. So we're going to go ahead and delete some stuff that we don't need. So delete app.css, app.test.js. We'll delete the logo, report web vitals, and setup tests.js. Next, we'll jump into index.js and we can delete the import for report web vitals, and we can delete this stuff at the bottom. Finally, we'll jump into app.js and we'll delete everything here and we'll create our own app component from scratch. So we'll say const app is equal to an arrow function, and this will just return some text which we will display on the browser just to make sure everything is working. And we'll export this component at the bottom. Like so. Now if we open up our terminal again, and this time we'll do npm start. This will open up a browser with our text, hello React, and if we change some things in our code and save, it should automatically update, and it does. So that's our project set up and ready to go. Okay, so we're going to jump straight into the good stuff and create our notes list component. If we look at the finished example, this is what the notes list will look like. So we're going to have a few notes in this grid layout, and we're going to have a thing down here that lets us add some notes as well. We'll add the title and the search bar thing later, but for now we're just going to concentrate on this list. Back in our code, if you go to the source folder and create a new folder called components. In here, we will create a file called NotesList.js, and we'll create our function. So it'll be const notes list. It's going to be equal to an arrow function. In the return statement of our function, we'll add a div with a class name of notes list, like so, and we'll export our function. Within the notes list div, we'll take a few lines and we'll render a note component, which we haven't created yet. So we'll likely have more notes in here at some point. Placing the notes inside a div like this makes it easier for us to control the layout of the notes using CSS Grid, which we'll see shortly. So we have our notes list, which holds all the notes. Next, we'll create the note component, which is the yellow box that we see here. So back in our code, if we jump back into the components folder, add a new file called note.js, and we'll create our function, const note. It's going to be equal to an arrow function. And in the return statement, we're going to have a div with a class name of note, like so, and we'll export our component. So the note div is going to act as the parent div for this note component. This makes it easier for us to style an individual note and easier to position the individual elements within a note. Let's add the different parts of the note before we get to the styling. If we look at our finished example, we're going to have a section that holds the text up here, and we're going to have a section at the bottom which holds the date that the note was written on and a delete icon. Back in our code, we'll take a few lines inside the div. We'll add a span. This will hold the text of the note. You can put whatever you want in here. I'm just going to say, hello, this is our first note. Hooray. Like so. Next, we'll add a div for the footer, which will give a class name of note footer. This is going to hold the date and the delete icon. So we'll add a small tag and put our date inside it. This can be anything you want for now. And next we need to import the delete icon from React icons. So at the top of our file, we'll do import, open braces, md delete forever. This is just the name of the icon from the package, from react-icons/md, just like so. And to render this icon, we jump back into our JSX, just below the small tag, open an angle brace, and we'll type md delete forever and close our braces like so. And we will give this a class name of delete icon. Since we're going to add some styles to this later, we'll give it a size of 1.3 em, like so. This is the basic structure of our note. Now if we jump back into the NotesList component, we need to import the note, as it's telling us that note is not defined. So at the top, we'll do import note from open quotes /note, like so. And our error goes away. Next, we'll import our notes list into our app. So if we jump into app.js, we can delete this paragraph tag and we'll add a div with a class name of container. So this is just going to be the div that helps us make the Notes app responsive. And inside our container, we will render the notes list like so. And if Visual Studio Code doesn't import the component for you, just make sure that you add import notes list from component/notes list at the top. Now if we save this and start the app, if you haven't already, and we'll jump into the browser, and yep, it looks pretty terrible. That's okay, since we're just putting our blocks in place and we haven't added any styles yet. We'll jump back into the code and open up noteslist.js, and we'll just add a few more notes in here, as this makes things a bit easier to see visually when we come to position everything. So if we save this, and we'll jump back into our browser. So we have our 4 notes here, and they all appear very ugly. If we look in the DevTools, you can see we have the basic structure of our app. So we have a container, we have the notes list. Inside the notes list, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 notes, and inside each note, we've got our text and we have our footer section. Inside the footer section, we have our date and we've got our icon. Okay, so now we've got some elements in place. We'll look at styling each note and position things using CSS Grid. Okay, so we'll start by styling our note. Remember, we've added a div with a class name of note in the note component, which keeps all the related note elements together. So the note class is the first one we'll work with. Let's open up index.css. And as you can see, Create React App has given us some very basic styles already. So we'll just leave these alone as we don't need them, and they don't do very much. If you prefer to copy the style sheet instead of typing out the CSS, you can get the link to the GitHub file in the description. So in here, we will take a new line at the bottom, and we're just going to type .note and open some braces. So all these styles will get applied to any element with the note class. The first thing we'll do is add a background color, and this is going to be a value of FEF68A, We don't want it to be too yellow, as this can be quite jarring, but this can be any color you like really. And if we save, you can see our app updates in the browser. So we'll just keep this open so we can visualize the code changes as we go. Next, we'll add a margin bottom. So say margin bottom, and we'll give this a value of 10px. This is just a temporary style to space out the notes so we can see each one better. Later, we'll remove this and use CSS Grid to handle the spacing, as this makes for better responsiveness as well. So next, we'll add the border radius, and we'll give this a value of 10. This makes things look less sharp and easier on the eye. Doing this has actually pushed our text a bit too close to the edge of our note, as you can see over here. So we're going to add some padding, which will give us a gap around the inner border of the note and push the text away. So we'll say padding, and we'll just give this a value of 1 rem. So rem is a unit which means relative to the font size. If we change the font size, then the padding will change size as well, and it means we don't have to go and change this. Lastly, we'll add a min height, as we want all our notes to be the same size. So we'll just hardcode a value of 170 pixels. And as you can see, it's updated our height. Okay, so our notes are coming along well. Now we want to position the date and the remove icon so that they sit at the bottom of the note. So if we look at our finished example, we have the date to the bottom left, and we have our remove icon to the bottom right. When we want to position things horizontally or vertically in a single line, we can achieve this by using flexbox. We will say display flex to say the note div is a flexbox container. And if we save this, as you can see in the browser, the default thing that flexbox does is arrange the child elements in a single row. So we have our text off to the left, and the note footer element is off to the right. So to fix this, we will say flex direction column. And if we save, you can see things are now stacked vertically. Next, we will say justify content space between, which means evenly space the items within the note container, with the first item positioned at the start of the container and the last item positioned at the end of the container. So if we save this, you can see things have dropped to the bottom and our text has been pushed to the top. So because we have set the flex direction as being a column, the start of the container in this case is going to be the top of the note, and the end of the container is going to be the bottom of the note. Flexbox works by positioning its direct children. If we look at note.js, we've only got two child elements, the span and the footer div. These are the things that Flexbox will position. Flexbox doesn't care that there's text inside the span or that there are more elements inside the note footer. It only cares about its direct children. So we have our note text and our note footer nicely spaced out, although our footer is looking a bit funny. There is no spacing and the alignment is a bit off. So we'll look into that now. If we look at Note.js, you'll see we put the date and the delete icon inside a div with a class name of note footer. This note footer div will be the Flexbox container, allowing us to position the date and the delete icon a bit easier. So we'll jump into index.css and create a new class just below the note class called note footer. We will add display flex to say that this is a Flexbox container, and next we'll add align items center. So this vertically aligns the items to be in the center of the container. Currently things are a bit off, as we can see over here, but if we save this, watch what happens. Everything now aligns up nicely. Next we'll add justify content space between, so that the first child element gets positioned at the start of the container and the last child element will get positioned at the end of the container over here. So if we save this, it works. Now if we move the window about, you can see that no matter what size we go to, the elements always stay where they're supposed to be. However, if we expand the window too much, you'll notice that our notes become massive. This is because they are plain old div elements still. So we'll look at how to use CSS Grid to help us arrange these notes nicely. Okay, so now we're going to use CSS Grid to position and resize the notes to make everything responsive. If we look at NotesList.js, you can see we have wrapped the notes in a div with a class name of NotesList. This div will be the CSS Grid container, and it works similar to Flexbox in that we can specify how we want the layout to work, and CSS Grid will arrange its direct children based on this. So if we jump back into index.css, we'll remove the margin bottom from the note class, since we're using CSS Grid for the layout now. We will create a new class called NotesList, and the first property that we will add will be display grid. So this just says that the NotesList div is a CSS Grid container. Next, we'll add a grid gap of 1 rem. This adds spacing around each of our grid items, in this case our notes. So if we save this, you can see it's added some spacing just below each one. Next, we'll add the grid template columns. This specifies how many columns we want our grid to have. We have 4 notes for now, so we'll say repeat 4 inside the braces, comma 250 pixels. This tells CSS Grid, okay, I want 4 columns, each one with a set width of 250 pixels. If we save this, we can see it kind of works, as our notes are now being resized correctly and are on the same line, but as we can see, it's not responsive. The problem here is that we're hard coding the number of columns to 4 and the size of the columns to 250. We'll delete this 4 and we will say auto fit. This will automatically resize our columns based on our column size, which we specified here. So instead of the 250, we're going to delete this. We're going to type min max and open some braces. In here, we'll type 250 px, comma 1fr. This lets us specify a range as opposed to a single value. A column cannot be smaller than 250 pixels, and it cannot be bigger than 1 fractional unit. A fractional unit just means whatever space is available. Now if we save this, watch what happens in the browser. Everything suddenly starts to work. So if we make our browser bigger, you can see the notes are resizing. And when CSS Grid detects that another note of 250 pixels can fit on the screen in the next column, it automatically adds it for us. And same if we go back into the small size, it only has 1 on each line. This line is doing most of the magic, and it basically means fit as many columns as you can in a row, and each column can resize within the given range to fit whatever space is available. So it's a very clever line of code, so it's good to understand what's happening. Feel free to stop here and play around with this a bit more and explore how it works. If you want me to go more in depth with CSS Grid, drop me a comment below. Okay, so now we've made our actual notes list responsive. We'll add a container div to the app to help us center everything in the middle of the page on larger screens. This is good for UX, as it means the user isn't having to look at the full width of the screen. Just above the notes list, we'll add a class called container. So in here, we'll add a max width of 960 pixels. This means the stuff within the container will not go over this width. Next, we'll add margin right of auto and margin left auto. This helps keep everything centered on large screens. So as we expand out, you can see the notes stay in the middle of the screen, regardless of the screen size. Finally, we'll add some padding. So we'll type padding right of 15 pixels and padding left of 15 pixels as well. This prevents the notes from being pushed to the edge of the screen. So if we save this, you can see it just adds a bit of padding to the left and the right, which looks nicer. So I'll expand out again, and you can see our notes list is quite responsive. Okay, so now our notes list is nice and responsive. We will render the list based on some dynamic data. Before we can do this, we first need a list of notes. In app.js, we'll use the useState hook to hold our array of notes. So just inside the app function, we'll take a new line, we'll type const, open our square braces, we'll type notes, comma, set notes, and this is going to be equal to useState, and we need to import the useState hook from React. So we'll import useState from React. Since we're going to be actively changing this data, it's a good idea to put it in state. And because we are working with lists, we will store our notes in an array. We can initialize a state hook by passing in a value to the useState function. This is a good place to pass our array. Each item in the array is going to hold certain things we need to know about a given note. If we look at the finished example, we need to know the text of the note and we need to know the date. So we'll create a few objects with some dummy note data. Inside our array, we'll open our braces and we will add the text. So this can be whatever you want. I'm just going to add some text in here that says this is my first note, and we'll do a comma and we'll add the date. So the date is going to be in the short string format. So for this one, I'll just say 15/04/2021. We'll also add an ID in here, since we'll need this later when deleting notes. So to create an ID, we're just going to use nano ID, which we call like so. We just need to import this. So at the top, we will do import, open braces, nano ID from nano ID, and save. Next, we're going to copy this object a few times, just to give us some more notes to play with. And we'll change some of these things about. So I'll change the text of the second one to say this is my second note, and the text of the third note to say this is my third note. And we'll change the dates just so that they're different. Okay, so now we have our notes list stored in state. We need to pass the notes variable to the notes list component down in here so that the notes list component can render each note. We can do this via props. So in our notes list component, we'll create a new prop called notes, and this is going to be equal to the notes we just created in state up here. Now in NotesList.js, we destructure the props to get the notes that were just passed in. So we'll open our braces and we'll type notes. Next, in our return function, we will use the map function to loop over our list and render a note component. So instead of a set number of notes, this makes things more dynamic. So just inside the notes list div, we will take a new line, open our braces, and then we'll say notes.map, and we'll pass in our function to the map function. The map function will pass the current note to our function. And then we want to say for each note, we want to render a note component, like so. And we can delete these hard-coded notes. Now if we save this, you can see in the browser, it is displaying the 3 notes. But the data is still showing the hard-coded data that we've added in the note component. To fix this, back in our map function, for each note that gets rendered, we want to pass in the text, the date, and the ID as props to the note component. So in our note component, we'll create these props. We'll say ID is equal to note.id, text will be equal to note.text, and date will be note.date. Now in our note component, we can destructure the props to get the things we need. So we'll get the ID, the text, and the date that was just passed in from the notes list to this note component. Now that we have this data, we can go and delete the hard-coded text and replace it with the text that was passed in via props. And we can do the same with the date. So we don't need the ID right now, so we'll just leave that one alone. Now if we save and try this, you can see our notes update from the array in state. make this a bit smaller so we can see our code again. And if we add another note in state, so if we copy and paste this, and we'll say this is my new note, and we'll change the date as well. And if we save this, you can see it has appeared at the bottom. So I should mention that for this app, we will store most of the state in the top level app component. This makes sense to do as we will have different pieces of state that rely on each other, and having the state in one place makes this easier. Okay, so now we will look at how to add a new note. If we look at the finished app, we have this blue input that lets us type a note. We also have this counter thing, which tells us how many characters are remaining. If we click save, the note gets added to the list and the input resets. The date gets automatically added based on the current date, and a remove icon gets added as well. We will start this one by adding the component and adding the styles. Then we will add the JavaScript after. In Visual Studio Code, if we open up our project tree, go to source components and add a new file called add note.js. In here, we will create our component. So say const add note. It's going to be equal to an arrow function, and we'll open our braces and type return and open some braces. In the return statement, we will add a new div. This will be the container div for the add note component, which we will use to style the background and position the different elements. The component is going to look similar to the note component, so we can reuse the note class here instead of creating new styles. Go ahead and add class name equals note. We will also add a new class so we can add specific styles to this add note component. Inside this div, we're going to add a text area. This is where the user can type their note. We will add 8 rows so that it doesn't go too tall, and add 10 columns so that it doesn't go too wide. Lastly, we'll add a placeholder that says type to add a note. Next, we'll add the note footer. The note footer is going to contain the save button, and it's going to contain the characters remaining. Just outside the text area, we will create a new div with a class name of note footer. This will be the container div for the footer. Remember, we already created a CSS class that positions the footer elements for us when we created our note component. So here we are simply reusing this class. Inside this div, we'll add a small tag which will hold the character count. You can just hard code some text for now, just to make sure that things are visually okay, and we will add the JavaScript for this later. Next, we'll add our button. So the button is what triggers the event that saves the note. We will give it a class of save, and we'll add some text which says save as well. Lastly, we'll export our component, export default add note. Okay, so this looks to be our UI elements in place. Let's save and see what it looks like. So if we save, jump into our app, and it hasn't appeared. So let's have a look. Oh, we haven't rendered our add note component in our NotesList component. So if we open up NotesList.js, we'll import the add note component. So import add note from open quotes /add note. And just outside the map function in our JSX, we will render the component. Now if we save this, and hopefully it appears, and it does. So the reason we put it here is because we want it to be part of the CSS grid so that it flows nicely along with the other notes, regardless of how many notes there are. So it's showing up in our app now, and it doesn't look too bad. Things are generally where we want them, which is good. Now we just need to style it up so that it looks like the finished example. We'll jump into index.cs, and we'll take a new line under the notes list. We want to keep the majority of the styles we created already when we created the note. So we will add a new class called .note.new and open braces. The styles we put in here will apply to all elements which have the note CSS class and the new CSS class. So in our add note.js, we've added both these classes. which means any styles that we add in index.css will apply to this div. This is a good approach to reusing styles without having to duplicate them. So in here, we'll say our background color, and we'll just add a value. So this will give us the bluish color, but this can be whatever you want. If we save this, you can see down here that it's changed. Okay, now we want to style the text area to remove the border and change the background color to match our component. So go ahead and take a new line, and then we'll say text area. We don't need a dot in front of the class this time, as this is a native HTML element that we are referencing. Open up the braces, and we're going to say border none, which removes the border, and we'll say resize none. So this removes the expandable thing, which the text area comes with. So we don't want the user to be able to drag this thing about and mess up our nice responsive layout. So we'll just disable that. And lastly, we want the background color to match the component's color. So we'll just copy the background color, which we added up here, and paste it down here. Now if we save this, you can see it gives us this nice fancy input effect. However, if we click on it, you can see it still has this blue border, which doesn't look very nice. So to remove this, we'll jump back into index.css. We'll take a new line. We will say text area, and we'll add a pseudo element of focus, and open our braces. The styles in here will apply to any text area which is on focus. We just need to add outline none and save. Now if we click this, you can see the blue border has disappeared and it looks much nicer. Okay, so now we just need to style this button. We'll create a new class called save. Remember, we added this to our button in the component in add_note.js down in here. So for this, we will say background color. We will give it a gray color. We will remove the border. We'll add a border radius of 15 pixels, and we'll add some padding. So we'll say the top will be 5 pixels, the right will be 10 pixels, the bottom will be 5 pixels, and the left will be 10 pixels. Now if we save this, you can see it's updated in the browser, and we've made this nice grey button with some rounded corners which matches the theme of our app. But you'll notice that if we hover over it, or it doesn't indicate to the user that it's clickable, so we just need to add some hover styles. So say save, and this time we use the hover pseudo element. Open our braces, and we will add some styles in here that will apply when the user hovers over the button. So we'll add a background color which goes slightly lighter. So we'll say, and we will add a cursor pointer to change the cursor. Now if we save this, and if we hover over it, you can see the color changes and the cursor changes. Okay, so now we have our add new note component created. However, it doesn't do very much yet, so we will add the JavaScript to make it all work. Okay, so now we will look at how to save a note. Before we can save the note, we need to know what the user has typed. To do this, we will use the useState hook to save the value. So if we jump into add_note.js, we will take a new line just inside the function, and we'll type const, open braces, note text, comma, set note text. And this is going to be equal to useState. And we're going to default it to an empty string, since that's what we want our text box to start off with. So it's telling us that useState is undefined, which means we need to import it. So we do import braces useState from React. Okay, so now when the user types into our text area, we want to update this state value. We can do this by adding an onChange property and passing in a function. So in our text area, we will say onChange is going to be equal to handle change. So we have to create this function, which we'll do up here. So we'll take a new line just beneath our state objects, and we will type const handle change is going to be equal to an arrow function. And React will automatically pass in the event as an argument, which we can get up here. So we'll call this event, and this gets passed to our function. The event has a bunch of stuff in it, but the main thing we care about is the target.value. This is the value of the text area, in other words, what the user has typed. So if we log this out for now, we'll say console.log event.target.value, and we'll save this. If we check this in Chrome, so we'll open up our DevTools. Every time we type, you can see it gets logged out. So this happens on every keystroke, which means the value will get updated on every keystroke in state. So we'll close this down and jump back into our code. Now we have the value. We can set this to state by calling the setNoteText function given to us by the useStateHook. So in our handle change function, we can delete the console log and we'll say setNoteText, and we want this to be the event target.value, which we just seen. So now our state will get updated every time the value of the text area changes when the user types. We also want to add value equals note text in our text area, as this gives us a bit more control over what the text area value is. So for example, if we wanted to set a default value in here or reset the text value, we can simply update state and the changes will take effect. Next, we want to save the note when the user clicks the save button. We will add a property to the button called onClick. This will be a function call, which we will name handle save click. And up here, we will create the function const handle save click is going to be equal to an arrow function. Okay, so what we want to happen in this function is that the state gets updated with the new note. Since the state lives in the top level component in app.js, here the child component addNote.js does not know how to update the state. To solve this, we need to pass a function from the parent, in this case app.js, which allows the child to update the state. So in other words, we create a function in app.js and then we pass it down through the components, and addNote.js can use this function to update the state in app.js. So in app.js, just below our state values, we will create a new function called addNote. And this will be an arrow function, and it's going to accept the text that the user has added. For now, we will log a message to the console saying what the text will be. So we'll say console.log text, and we will come back to actually updating the state in a minute. First, we just want to make sure our addNote component can call this function by passing it down through the components. So we will pass this to the NotesList as a prop, which we'll call handle add note, and we'll make this equal to our function. In the NotesList component, we can destructure this to get access to that function via the props, and we will pass it to the addNote component. So we'll say handle addNote is going to equal to handle addNote. Now in the addNote component, we will destructure the props again to get this function. So now our addNote function has access to the handle addNote function. We can simply call it from our event handler function in here. So we'll say whenever handle save click gets called by the button, we want to call handle addNote, and we'll pass in the text of the note, which in this case is our note text variable that we stored in state. So if we paste this in, so if we save this and we will open our DevTools again, if we type a note, so say hello, this is a new note, and if I click save, you can see it appears here. This means our component is able to call the addNote function correctly. So we'll close this and jump back into our IDE. So the last piece of this puzzle is to actually update the state with the new note. So in app.js, the addNote function, which currently takes the text, we will build up a new note object which has the same properties as our other notes and save this to state. So in addNote function, we will delete the console log as we don't need that anymore. And the first thing we'll do is create a date object. So const date equals new date. Remember, each note has a date assigned to it. Next, we'll create the new note object. So I say const new note will be equal to an object. And then we'll say the text is going to be whatever text gets passed to us from the add note component, which captures the user input. So we'll say text and take a comma. Next, we'll say date, and we're going to take the date from the date object we created up here. So we'll say date dot to local date string. So this will convert the date to whatever format that your local country understands. And the last thing we want to do in here is add an ID. So we'll say ID, and then we will just call the nano ID function to generate a new ID, like so. Now we need to create a new array that has the existing notes, and we'll add the new note onto the end of this array. So we'll say const new notes is going to be equal to open some square brackets, and then we're going to use the spread operator to copy the current array of notes. We'll take a comma, and then we will add our new note onto the end by typing new note. So we need to do this as it's bad to mutate state in React. This line creates a new array instead of updating the old array. Finally, we just have to call the setNotes function and pass in our new notes, which will update the state. So at this point, when we call setNotes, this causes the components to re-render and the list updates with the new data. So let's bring our browser back into view. If we add a new note in here by typing something in the box, and if we click save, you can see that it works and the note gets added, and it adds the current date, and it adds the bin icon as well. Okay, so I want to spend a second to talk about how we pass the add note function down the tree of components. So we define it in app.js, and we pass it through the NotesList component and into the add note component. This is what we call prop drilling, the process of passing things through components until it gets where it's needed. So this is a perfectly fine approach. However, if you find yourself doing this for many components, this is when you might consider using something like the context API, which prevents having to pass your data through a bunch of different components. Okay, so before we move on to displaying the character count, there are a few tidy up things to do. Firstly, the user can add a blank note or a note with empty blinds, which is no good. So if I take some spaces in here and click save, you can see it gets added. Or if I hit enter a few times, I have all this extra space, but it still gets added as well. And secondly, the text on the add note component stays even after we have added our note, which is no good either. So if I add a note in here and click save, the note gets added okay, but we still have the text here, which means the user has to go in and delete the text if they want to add a new note. So if we jump back into our IDE, we will have a look at the first issue. So we'll jump into add note.js. We basically want to check if the value the user has typed is valid before we save it to state. So the best place to do this is in the handle save click function. So in here, we want to take a new line, and then we'll say if note text.trim, the trim function removes white space from the start and the end of a string. And then we want to check the length. So do .length. If the length is greater than 0, that means after the white space has been removed, we still have some text, which means we can go ahead and call our handle add note function, which will update the state. So we'll just paste that inside the if block. If the note text is empty, then it's just going to skip over this block and not do anything. So now if we bring up our Chrome again, and we'll try this. So if we add some space and click save, you can see it doesn't do anything, and it doesn't save to our app. And if we add a bunch of spaces and click save, you can see it still doesn't do anything. So that's the first issue fixed. So the next issue is that we want to reset the form after a note gets added. So we'll go into our ID, and after we've added a note, we just want to set the note text back to an empty string, like so. So if there is a value, it's going to get added to state, and our input should hopefully reset. So let's try this one. In the browser here, we will add a bunch of text like so, and if we save, you can see the note gets added and our note resets again. Okay, so the next feature we will add is the character count. So if we look at our finished example, when the user types into the input, you can see the character count goes down on each keystroke. If we paste some stuff in here, once we get to the character count limit, we cannot type anymore. If we press backspace or delete the text, the character count updates to reflect. So if we jump into our code and going to add note.js, you can see in our JSX that we have a hard-coded value of 200 for the characters remaining. What we want to do is update this to reflect the amount left. Okay, so to do this, we'll create a plain variable at the top of the function called character limit, and this is going to be equal to 200. We don't need to put this in state since the user cannot change it. If we added a feature where the user could change this number, it would be a good idea to hold it in state, but for now, this is fine. Remember, we stored a note text in state, which means that we have easy access to whatever the user has typed in the form of the note text variable. So now in our JSX, we can delete the hard-coded 200 and open some braces. In here, we can say character limit minus note text dot length. This subtraction will give us the characters remaining. If the limit is 200 and the note text dot length is 100, that means there are 100 characters left. So now if we save this and open it in our browser, if we type some stuff in here, you can see the character count has started to go down. And if we backspace, the character count has started to go up. So this works because every time the user types, remember we are updating the state with the new value they have typed. The handle change function gets called, and in here, we set the state to the new value. When we set the state, React re-renders the component, meaning this little subtraction gets run again, displaying the new value. Okay, so this almost works, but if we type over the limit, the count goes into the minus. So if we paste some stuff here, it says we have 2 characters left, but if we keep typing, it goes into the minus and it just doesn't work very well. What we want to do here is prevent the text from updating if the new value the user has typed goes over our limit of 200. So we'll jump back into our code. It makes sense to do this in our handle change function, as this is where the value gets saved to state. If we add an if statement in here and open our braces, in here we're going to type character limit minus event.target.value.length, and then we're going to say greater than equal to 0. So what this does is subtracts the length of the value that the user has typed from the character limit. If this value is greater or equal to 0, that means the limit has not been reached or is at its maximum. So we can go ahead and update state with the new value that the user typed. So we get the value from the event, which is what event.target.value is. If the subtraction is a minus, that means the user has entered more characters than is allowed or has reached the limit. So it's just going to skip over this condition block. So add some braces here to make sure our code is consistent, and we'll paste the setNoteText function just inside. So we'll save this and we'll jump back into Chrome and we'll try this out. So now if I paste something in here with 2 characters remaining and I try to type, it's going to let me type 2 more characters, but after that it sees that the limit's been reached and I can't type anymore. This is a good example of how to do checks and validations in your app. If you need to do a check before saving something to state, doing it in the event handler function is a good idea. Okay, so far so good. However, there is one issue that we need to look at. If we add a new note and take a few lines. So we'll add some more stuff with some line breaks in between. If we save, you will notice that the line breaks are lost. To fix this, we will jump into index.css and add a new property to our note class. Since we rendered a note text within the note div, we just need to tell this div to keep the line spacing when it renders the text. To do this, we will say whitespace pre-wrap. This just means keep any spacing that was added to the text. Now if we save this, you can see the spacing has now appeared on the note. And we'll add a new one just to make sure. If we save, the spacing has persisted here as well. Now we can add notes. The next thing that makes sense to do is delete a note. So in our app, each note has a little delete icon. When this is clicked, we want to call a function that removes the note from state. So in app.js, we will create a function called delete note. So just below the add note function, we'll do const delete note, and this will be equal to an arrow function. This will accept the ID of the note to be deleted. Remember, each note in our array has an ID, and when we add a new note, it generates an ID as well. So in our delete note function, we will use the filter function on the notes array. So we'll say notes.filter to remove the note that has the same ID as the ID that was passed in. So we'll pass in our function to the filter function. This gives us the current note. For the condition, we will say note.id is not equal to the ID that was passed in. So the filter function returns a new array, so we don't have to worry about creating a new array like we did before when we added a note. Instead, we can just assign this to a variable. So we'll say const new notes is equal to our statement here. Lastly, we will set this in state by saying set notes and passing in our new notes array. Similar to the add note function, we will pass the delete note function down the component tree so it can be called from the note component. We will create a new prop in the notes list called handle delete note, and this will be equal to our delete note function that we just created. So in NotesList.js, we can destructure this from the props. So we'll say handle delete note, and we'll pass it to the note component as a prop. So we'll say handle delete note is going to equal to handle delete note. So we're just passing this down the tree. Now in note.js, we can do the same thing. So we'll just destructure the handle delete note function from the props. So when our delete icon or the bin icon is clicked, we want to delete the note. So we'll add our onClick property to the icon. So say onClick is equal to, and this time we're going to pass in a function. And then we'll say handle delete note, and we'll pass in the ID of this note, which we get from the props up here. So sometimes it makes sense to just call the function directly from the onClick property like so. This is because we do not have any other logic here. Okay, so if we save this, and we will try it in the browser. So if we delete this note, it gets removed from state and gets removed from our app. So it looks like our little delete icon doesn't have any hover effects, which is bad as it doesn't indicate that this element is clickable. We can fix this by adding some CSS. So we'll jump back into our code and we will have a look at the delete icon and see if we've added a CSS class, and we have. We can add our styles to the delete icon class. If we jump into index.css and we will scroll to the bottom, and then we'll say dot delete icon to create this CSS class. Next, we'll just say cursor pointer and save. And now anytime we hover over the delete icon, you can see the cursor changes to a pointer. This is just a better experience for the user as it indicates that the icon is clickable. Okay, so our little app is starting to shape up. We can view, add and delete notes. Next, we will look at searching for a note by typing in a search bar. So as you can see in the finished example, in the top section here, we have this search bar. If we type into the search bar, you can see that the notes start to filter based on the note text. So if the user has typed new note, then it's going to look for all the notes that has the text of new note. And as we backspace, you can see that the notes start to appear again. If we delete the search value completely, all the notes appear again. So we'll start this one by styling this search bar. So in our code, in the project tree, we're going to go to source components folder and add a new file called search.js and save. In here, we will create our component. So the import React from React, and we will create our arrow function. So say const search is equal to an arrow function, and then we'll return some JSX. So we'll put some divs in for now, and we'll export our component. Export default search. So to achieve this style of the search bar, we are going to have a container div, which is this gray bit here, that holds an icon and an input field. We will then style these things so that it looks like a fancy search bar. In our code, in search.js, we're going to add a class name to this div called search. This will be the container and will hold the icon and the text input. So we'll add those next. Inside the div, we'll take a new line and we're going to type md search and give this a class name of search icons. And we'll say size is going to be equal to 1.3 em. We'll close this. Now it's saying md search is not defined. That's okay because we haven't imported it yet. So md search comes from the React icons pack, similar to the delete icon that we used previously. So we'll do import open braces md search from React icons /md. And now we will add the input. This is what the user will type into to search for the notes. So the input just below md search, and then we'll say the type of this is going to be text, and the placeholder we will say type to search. Okay, so this is the basic parts of our component. So now we will render this in our app just to see how things are spaced out. So in app.js, in our return statement of the app function, we want to take a new line just inside the container before the NotesList component, and this is where we will call our search component. And it's saying search is not defined. So if we scroll to the top, we'll do import search from components /search. And if we save this, let's have a look and see how things look so far. So I'll space these windows out a bit. And if we go to our app, you can see we have our icon and our search bars appeared. Okay, so now we will style these things so that they look like our finished example. So the first thing we'll do is style the container, which is the gray bit, and we will position the icon and the search input so that they're nice and neat. We'll keep this open so that we can see how things look as we're coding. Back in Visual Studio Code, we'll go to index.css and we'll scroll to the bottom. We'll take a new line and then we'll type search. Remember, this is the class that we added to our components container div in search.js. And the first thing we'll do is we will say display flex. So this means that the search div is going to be a flexbox container, which will help us position the search icon and the text box a bit easier. So if we save this, you can see things have started to align already, which is good. Then we'll say align items center, just to make sure things have aligned vertically. We'll say background color is going to be equal to this gray color. We'll just add an RGB value for this. Now if we save, you can see it's appeared. Next we'll add a border radius of 10 pixels. This will give us the rounded edges here. So I'll just zoom out a bit so we can see better. And we will add some padding so that the icon and the input aren't pushed too close to the end. So we'll say padding of 5 pixels. And then we'll say margin bottom of 1.5 EM to give us some spacing. Okay, so if we expand this out, you can see we have a search bar. So it looks a bit funny on small screens because I am zoomed in on Chrome here quite a bit so that you can see. But if we expand it out, you can see that everything is aligned. We have some nice borders which match the style of our app. And we have an icon and a text input which is nicely aligned as well. So now we can style the text box so that we hide the border and change the color to match our gray search bar. We will say search space input. We want to apply these styles to any inputs that are within the search div only. So we'll say border none, which removes the border. And the background color is going to be the same as what we said for our search input. So we'll just copy this and we'll paste it in like so. And as you can see, this has changed the color to match. So it's looking good so far. However, if we click on it, you can see we have this blue outline, which is no good. So in index.css, we'll take a new line. And this time we're going to say search input, and we're going to use the pseudo element of focus, which applies any styles to a focused element, or in other words, that the user has clicked on. So in here, we'll just say outline with a value of none. And if we save this, we will expand our window. If we click on it, we still have the cursor that's blinking, which tells us that we can type in here along with the placeholder, and we can type stuff in. Okay, so now we have our search thing in place. We can start adding the logic to make it work. If we think about what we need to do here, first we need to capture the value that the user has typed. Next, we need to filter the notes to only show the notes that contain that text. We will focus on capturing the input value first. Similar to before, we want to use a state hook to store the value that the user types. We could put this hook in search.js as that's where the input is, but since our notes list will rely on this state, it makes sense to keep these pieces of state close together. So instead, we will put this hook in app.js. Jump into app.js, and just below the notes hook, we will create our own hook to store the search text. So down here, we'll type const, open our square braces, and we'll say search text, comma, set search text. And this is going to equal to use state and set the initial state to be an empty string. Now we can pass the set search text function to the search component as a prop. So down in here, we will say handle search note, and this will be equal to set search text. This is our hook function that lets us update the state of our search text. In search.js, we can destructure this prop to get the function. So we'll add our curly braces in here, and then we'll say handle search note. In our input, we can do an on change property and pass in our function. So this function will be an arrow function, which takes the event that gets passed in by React. And then we can say handle search note, and we will get the value that the user has typed from event.target.value. So anytime the user types into the input, it's going to call the handle search note prop, which has a function to update the state. So now we'll jump into Chrome and we will open the DevTools just to check that our state is getting updated. So in the Components tab here, you can see our app tree. So our state is in app.js, and over here you can see our two state hooks. So the first one has the array of notes, and the second one has our input value. So if we type into our search bar, you can see the state updates to reflect whatever it is. Our state hook is working, and we now have easy access to what the user types in the form of the search text value, which we stored in a hook in app.js. Now, what we can do is filter the notes based on the search term before it gets passed to the notes list. So in app.js, we have the notes list component and we pass some notes to it. So in here, what we can do is say notes.filter, and we'll pass in our function, which gives us the current note that the filter function is currently on. And then we will say note.text, which is the text of the note, to lowercase dot includes open braces, and then say search text. So what this will do is take the current list of notes, filter those notes to return only the ones that include the search text, and the search text is what the user has typed into the search bar. It will then pass the result of this to the notes list component as a notes prop. Now if we try this, we will try searching for second, and as you can see, it's only returned this note that has the text second in it. As we backspace, you can see it resets to return all the notes since we don't have a search term. So why do we filter the notes here at the point when we pass the notes to the notes list component? Well, by doing this, it means the original list in state up here is unchanged. So if you have another component that also relies on the full notes list, it won't be affected by any filtering. This is also a good example of why we keep related pieces of state as close together as possible. By doing this, we have made it easy to filter the list based on the search text, and the next developer coming along can easily see what's happening and find the different state things that they need. Next, we will look at adding the header that you can see just above the search bar. So we have a title and we have a button that toggles dark mode on and off. So in our code, we will jump into the components folder and add a new file called header.js. In here, we will create our component. So import React from React and create our function. So say const header is equal to an arrow function. And then we will return some JSX, and we'll put an empty div in here for now. And we'll export our component. So export default header. So in the return statement, similar to what we did before, we will create a div that will act as the container to help us position and style the title and the button. We will give this div a class name of header. Inside this div, we'll add a h1 tag, and we'll add our title, which is notes. And finally, we'll add our button, and we will add some text which says toggle mode. We will just reuse the styles from the save button, which we can see in our note is a gray rounded shape. So we'll just use these styles to prevent us creating any more styles. So in button, we will say class name is equal to save. You can change this name if you want in index.css to be more descriptive, but for now I'm just going to leave this like this. So now we have our header component, which has the different elements in it. We will render the header in app.js. In app.js, just above the search bar, we will open our angle brackets and type header and check that it's been imported, and it has. If not, you can get it from the components folder. So we'll bring this in a bit so we can see what things look like currently. So we have our title and our button has appeared. Now we need to style the header container div to space these things out evenly. So if we jump into index.css and just above the container class, we will add a CSS class for the header. So this is what we added to our component. And in here we will say display flex to say that the div that has the header class as a flexbox container. And then we'll say align items center. So as you can see, this has dropped the notes title and the toggle mode button onto the same line and aligned them vertically. Now we just need to say justify content space between. So this will push each of our elements to either end of the container, in this case to the left and to the right. So if we expand this out, you can see the toggle button always stays to the left hand side. Okay, so while we are in index.css adding some styles, we will go ahead and add our dark mode styles. So in our finished app, you will notice some things happen when we toggle dark mode. The background turns to black and the title changes from black to white. So in our index.css, we will take a new line just under the header and we'll add a CSS class for dark mode. And what we want to do in here is say background color black. So anytime we apply the dark mode class to any of our elements, in this case we'll be applying it to the top level div, it will turn the background color to be black. We also want to change the heading to be white. So we'll say dark mode h1 to select any headings within the dark mode divs, and we'll say color white. So this will just turn any text to be white. Now that our header and our styles are in place here, we can go ahead and add the logic to set dark mode. Remember, it's a good idea to put things that change in state. So we will use a state hook and store a Boolean value to indicate whether the app is currently in dark mode or not. We will do this in app.js, as that is where the majority of our state lives. So just below the search text state hook, we will create a new one. So we'll say const open braces dark mode comma set dark mode, and this is going to be equal to use state, and we will set an initial property of false. Since there are only two possible options, either the app is in dark mode or it isn't in dark mode, a boolean makes sense here. Now we will pass the set dark mode function to our header component. So we'll call this prop handle toggle dark mode, and this will be equal to our setter function for the dark mode state hook. So set dark mode. Now in the header component, we can destructure this prop to get the function. So we'll add our curly braces and say handle toggle dark mode, and we can call this in the onClick property of our toggle mode button. So say onClick is going to be equal to an arrow function, and we'll call handle toggle dark mode like so. When we call a setter function provided to us by a hook, we can get access to the current state value by passing in an arrow function with an argument. So in here, we can add an arrow function, and then we'll call this previous dark mode. Now in the body of our arrow function, we want to set the new state to be the opposite of what the current dark mode value is. So to do this, we can use an exclamation mark, and then we'll say previous dark mode. If dark mode is currently true, we're going to set it to be false, and vice versa. And we will fix our mistake here just to make things into camel case. So we'll change the lowercase m to an uppercase m. So if we open up our browser. If we click this, nothing happens. But if we look at our DevTools, you can see we have a new state hook that has appeared. This one is our dark mode value. So it is initially set to false. If we click toggle mode, it gets set to true. If we click toggle mode again, it gets set back to false. Even though our UI hasn't changed yet, our state is updating, which is what we want. Now, what we want to do is dynamically apply the dark mode class to our app, depending on if the dark mode state value is set to true. Remember, we added classes for dark mode in index.css already. So in app.js, we will create a new div and put our existing JSX within it. So we'll create a div and we will just paste everything that we previously had inside this new div. So this allows us to add styles to the overall app without affecting the styles and the layout we have created so far in the existing container div. So now we'll add a class name, and this is going to be equal to a template string. Open some braces and add some backticks within it. So in here, we are going to use a template string to determine if we should dynamically add the dark mode class to this div based on our dark mode state variable. So in our div, just inside the backticks, we will type a $, open our braces, and then we'll say dark mode $ampersand, open quotes, and then we'll type dark mode. So what this is going to say is if dark mode is equal to true, then add dark mode to this string. This line of code will create a string, and depending on the status of dark mode, it's going to append dark mode or not. And then it's going to apply the result of this to the class name of this div. So now if we try this, you can see if we toggle, it changes the background to black, and it changes the text depending on if the background is black or not. So it looks like we have one bug to fix, and that is that the background isn't taking up the whole screen. So it looks like we need to tell the inner container to take up 100% of the view, and that will push everything down. So if we jump into index.css, and if we go down to the container CSS class, we will say min height, it's going to be 100 vh. So this just means 100% of the view height. And hopefully if we try this again, it should work, and it does, so the gap has disappeared. Okay, so the last feature that we want to add to our app is that we want to save and retrieve from local storage so that the data persists even after we close the tab. So the best place to do this is in app.js, since this is where our state lives. So what we're going to do is just below our state objects, we're going to add the use effect hook. So the use effect hook lets us run code at certain points of the component's lifecycle, or if certain variables change. So it's telling us it's not defined, so we just need to import it. So at the top, just beside the use state import, we will say comma use effect. So this effect is going to save our notes to local storage anytime the notes change. So in here, in the function, we will say local storage dot set item and open braces. So we have to give it a key. The key is a string which we will use to retrieve the notes later. So we'll say react dash notes dash app dash data, just to make sure that it doesn't conflict with anything else. And outside the string, we will say a comma, and the second parameter that we pass into the set item function is the data that we want to save. It's a good practice to stringify any data before we save it to local storage. So we'll say json.stringify and open our braces. And now we'll pass in our notes. And if we save, what this will do is save the notes to local storage with a key of React notes app data. Now you can see that the use effect is saying missing a dependency notes. So you just need to type notes in here. So what this little array is this is the dependency array. So anytime something in here changes, so in this case, if the notes variable gets updated with new notes, then it's going to trigger this use effect function, which means the new notes will get saved to local storage. So if we try this, we can go to our app, and if we go to the application tab, you can see down the left here we have the local storage dropdown. If we click on localhost, you can see our data has appeared. So the key is React Notes app data, and the value is a string. If we look at this preview thing down here, you can see it has our note data. So it has the array and it has the 4 notes, each one with a date, an ID, and the text. So that means we have persisted our data in local storage. So if we jump back into our code, this is a good approach, as anytime the notes array changes, this will trigger automatically. This means that if you were to add new functionality, say edit a note, you wouldn't have to manually do this, because as long as you were saving the new notes to state in the state array, this use effect will get triggered. Okay, so now that we have saved the notes, what we want to do is retrieve any notes that are saved into local storage when the app loads. So again, we can use the use effect function for this. So we'll create another one. We'll type use effect, open our braces, and add our arrow function. Just outside the arrow function, we're going to do a comma and add an empty array. When the dependency array is empty in a use effect hook, that means it's only going to run on the first load and it won't run after that, which is what we want, because we only want to try and retrieve any notes on first load. So in here we can say const saved notes, and it's going to be equal to json.parse, because remember we save the data as a string when we set it. So whenever we would retrieve it, we have to parse the data into a JavaScript object, which is what this does. And in here we will say local storage.get item, and then we simply pass in our key. So our key is React Notes app data. So we can copy that, paste it in like so, and that's it. So the app is going to load. It's going to go to local storage, and it's going to retrieve the data that has this key, and it's going to parse it into a JavaScript object, and then it's going to save it to this saved notes variable. Now the last thing we need to do is check if we received any notes from local storage, and if we did, we want to set it into state. So I'll say if saved notes. This means if any of the notes were retrieved successfully from local storage, there will be a value. If there is a value, we will do set notes and pass in our notes, like so. If saved notes is empty or doesn't have a value, it won't set it to state and it will skip over this conditional. So now if we try this, if we jump into Chrome, and we will close this for a minute, and we have some notes that are in our app already. So if we add a new one, this is a saved note, and click save, it appears here. Now if we refresh the page, hopefully it works, and it does. And if we try going to a different tab, you can see that it has saved here as well. The beauty of using a use effect hook to handle the saving and retrieving of the notes is that we can delete the note, or 2 or 3, and if we refresh, it's going to automatically save and retrieve those notes from local storage. And that's because we have told these use effect hooks here to automatically save whenever the notes array has changed. So whenever we delete a note, it changes the notes array, and this triggers this to run. That about wraps it up for this video. If you enjoyed watching, it would be great if you could like and share this video, as it really helps the channel. If you added your own features, don't forget to tweet me. It's always good to see what you come up with. You can find different ways to contact me in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.